if we're really seeking our purpose in life, it's actually a path of healing because we're following those breadcrumbs of what disconnected us from our purpose back to it. And so for me, I think that really is incentivizing for doing some of the healing work.
Well, welcome to the True Man Podcast. You know, many people that I meet and talk to are not self-aware of themselves enough to begin to understand their purpose in life. Now, that may sound like a bold statement, but it's really true. And I talk with people who think that they're telling me their why, but are really rambling to make sense of it because of past trauma or baggage that they carry around. And that typically gets in the way of them taking action and moving forward. Now, when today's guest first reached out to me, I thought, well, we got to have a heart to heart about trauma and purpose in life. And that's what we're going to do today. So, welcome to the True Man Podcast, Luke Monteleone. Now, Luke is a transformational coach, a conscious business consultant, and his mission is to empathetically guide his clients to go through their own purpose of self-awareness and transformation in order to find their purpose. Luke, welcome to the True Man Podcast.
Mike, it's a pleasure to be here.
Now, I assume, Luke, that somebody that is a coach that is dealing with trauma and purpose has probably had something in their life that caused them to go down that road. So I'll let you jump in here and talk about how you got to the point where you got into this coaching area of trauma and purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, Mike, it's definitely a path that tends to be paved by, the struggles, to put it lightly. And I've had my fair share, no shortage of what seemed to be one roadblock after the next, specifically in my own life path, and this deep burning sort of desire, this what I'll only call this sense of purpose that has emanated from deep within my being, my soul, to fulfill a specific, I guess, objective in this life, wanting deeply to create more expansiveness, to want to transcend some of the limitations that I observed even early on in my childhood that were common themes in my lineage, with my ancestors, with the living ones at that time. And so, on this sort of quest to expand into new realms of possibility, like going beyond sort of the limitations that tend to be projections of what's possible that are put on us as a result of our family systems and as the cultures and the society and ultimately the communities that we grow up around, and that influence our development. I began early on to sort of practice this act of defiance and striving towards, very maybe sort of unapproved goals, unapproved. Yeah.
What did that look like? What did that look like for you?
So for me, that looked like, there was this, of course, so much of it is rooted in, trauma and trauma adaptations, but it was striving for this sort of ideal, from the wounded aspect of perfection, of, wanting to achieve at a very high level. So early on, that resulted in me sort of having this desire to be the best athlete. I played ice hockey growing up at the highest level. I played baseball at the highest level, both of which I had opportunities to continue to progress, play the college, the junior level for ice hockey. And so, it was striving in academics, to become, to be the straight A student. But ultimately, it was kind of, this is what it feels like I need to do to sort of transcend some of the limitations that I noticed existed within, my lineage, within my family of origin. And I wanted to experience the abundance, some of the greatest pleasures of life, and to experience abundance and richness and true wealth, and ultimately a sense of freedom, and ultimately freedom to be myself. And that looked very different than maybe some of the expectations that I felt like were placed upon me. So
Who was placing those expectations on you?
well, of course they
Outside
come
of yourself, we always have our own expectations, but
yeah, of course they come from the family itself. My dad was also a very he strove for perfection in his life. He's a high achiever,
yeah.
numerous professional degrees. And work ethic is not something that there's a shortage of in my family. And
Did
yet,
you have a close relationship with your father? I already see some similarities to what you're saying you were striving for and where he's at.
unfortunately, when I was younger, no. I think there was this direct opposition, because he had such specific expectations of what he thought his son, what he wanted for his son
Right.
in life, right? There was this ongoing sort of fight around me really trying to act from a place of self-preservation and wanting to pursue my own self-expression in my own unique way. And for better or for worse, because in a lot of ways, my father had some very sound advice, and I think that because there was maybe that level of expectation that was placed
Yeah.
upon me, that sort of led to maybe an unnecessary amount of resistance to the ways that he could have been helpful to me.
How did how do you feel like your father helped you to be the achiever that you became, that you were, and you've
Yeah.
become now?
So of course there's a blessing and a curse, right? When it comes to that level of expectation. On one end, I learned and adopted very early on the need to achieve. And so
Yeah.
there's never been I've never wanted an ordinary life. I've never settled. I've never felt complacent in any respect. And so it's just been this ongoing drive that, first felt like it was sort of an adaptation of my ego, if you will, the
Yeah.
trauma adaptations that led to kind of this perpetual chase around, if I achieve X, Y, and or Z, then I'll finally be enough. Then I'll finally be worthy. Right. The notorious sort of phenomenon that so many of us experience,
Yeah,
especially as
it's
men.
what a lot of men are chasing, I think.
That's right. Exactly. So, the curse aspect is that it's kind of like continuing to move the ball marker 10 yards forward. It's like every time you get to the destination, it's like you realize that it's actually not what you were actually seeking, not what you were striving towards, because so much of goals that I've realized is more of an emotional based feeling, right? It's a
Yeah.
feeling as opposed to the actual tangible result. And because I didn't feel enough when I had finally gotten to, the target destination, it just kept getting moved out further and further and further. So it was just this perpetual state of dissatisfaction that, of course, is an ongoing pursuit in life. Now, the advantages of that is, again, I think that work ethic, having this
Yeah.
work ethic that primes me for being a workhorse, for lack of better words, of not necessarily shying away from, putting in the work in order to achieve a specific goal, the tenacity, the perseverance, which, again, as a young man, more came from a place of like fight or flight,
Yeah.
this sort of sympathetic response in the nervous system that was like, I have to do this or else. And what I realized and what I experienced rather as I got into the latter part of my 20s is that was actually a very unsustainable sort of operating system, for lack of better words, because one can only live in that fight or flight response and that sympathetic activation in the nervous system for so long before they experience something like burnout or
Yeah.
overwhelm. And for me, that began to manifest as anxiety to the point of panic attacks. So
Wow.
it was,
And
yeah.
where do you think that came from? It was just something that was built up over time?
Yeah. I think that the body has specifically with my adaptations around, if we go into, if you're familiar with sort of like attachment theory, there's this adaptation to trauma or relational sort of ruptures, if you will, that looks like developing sort of this sort of armor, and it kind of is more dissociative adaptation. That means that we're disconnected from the actual feelings that may arise from something like, continuously being in that sympathetic activation. And so while I was in that, I was cut off from more of the bodily sensations. And so, that also manifests in the psyche as well, where I'm just not really taking into consideration the totality of all of the weight of everything that was continuing to compile and compound on top of itself in my life, aka the stressors, aka, it was like I could be avoidant, or rather ignorant is a better word, to all of the risk that I was taking.
Right.
To, like the what if. Ignorance is bliss in a sense, right? And I think when we're younger, we have a certain level of ignorance that tends to be advantageous for us going after maybe audacious goals.
Sure.
And as I got older and I started to I decided that I wanted to kind of go through this healing journey, because it was, as much as that, like being cut off and insulated from these outside stressors and these outside influences was advantageous, maybe in like a business sense, it was negatively impacting my relationships.
Yeah.
So, I couldn't connect with my significant other. There was a aversion, an inability to go deep and be vulnerable and experience something like intimacy. And then, I was coming to realize in my latter 20s that, that's something that I actually wanted to experience. And it became a pain point because relationships ended as a result of my inability to go there. So as I started to open up, the overwhelm of those outside pressures, even just the expectations that I was finally feeling for the first time in my life externally, but also echoes through my own consciousness, through my own expectations of self, really started to sort of, I began to sort of fold under the weight of that pressure, for lack of better words. Hence
Luke,
the panic
in
attack.
your work, have you found that in general the same thing is happening to a lot of, and I'm going to say men, because this, my show is predominantly for the men out there, that a lot of men kind of fall victim to that weight at a certain point. And by the way, it always seems to show up in relationships.
100%.
Always seems to show up in relationships for some reason. But I mean,
well, those are the mirrors. Those are the most potent mirrors that we have.
Yeah. And, I commonly say, the devil knows where to strike. And, if he can take out a family or take down a relationship, I mean, that's just one of the more intimate things that you got going on in your life. And so I think the beautiful part about having this conversation is that, we bring a light to what is really going on when we're dealing with trauma and dealing with things that show up in, relationships that we start to have as we become adults, because the two just don't work well together. If we're at war, and we're always at war, which is a good thing to know, if we're always at war, how do we fight that war and wake up every day and start fresh and so that we can have the relationships that we want? And I think what your story, what you're describing, is something very common to men. And I kind of, want to talk about that a little bit and help these guys that are listening to this go, yeah, I'm feeling that too. And how do I get out of that?
Perhaps it's a very challenging time to be a man in this, present day society. It's like I think we're going through a great transition. So, away from sort of the archetype that was embodied by our fathers, maybe, and our grandfathers, the post-war era, pick yourself up by your bootstraps.
Yeah.
And now there's this expectation I think it's coming directly from the mirroring, ultimately the evolution of the feminine, our female counterparts, our female lovers, specifically for us heterosexual men. And I think that adds a whole new element in terms of a pressure, in terms of the expectation of what's being placed on us to embody, to embrace a little bit more of our feminine aspects, which include things like feeling emotions, which, having a greater sensitivity and an attunement to our partners, to our children. And so it really goes against the grain, specifically with the conditioning that was likely passed along to us from our fathers and our fathers' fathers, which was that of sort of grit and more of, you know, what has been categorized as maybe unhealthy or even toxic masculine behaviors that in essence are sort of the foundation of the many structures that have been built in present day society that are very prominent, you know, in terms of the culture, in terms of the conditioning, the programming that we inherited. And so we're not only sort of been pre-programmed and downloaded those templates, but now we're being asked to shift tremendously towards opening more to the feminine aspects of ourselves to fully integrate. And so I think it's a rather challenging time, as any transition may be, in that we're trying to find maybe that happy medium between the two again. And it's like cultivating an entirely new foreign skill set, right?
Yeah.
Because what I've found in my own personal journey is the two feel very opposite. You know, if you know, when we're speaking, the audience is familiar with like what it feels like to be fully in your masculine versus fully in your feminine. It feels like you're living in polar opposites, which is the beauty of connection and of polarity, you know, between a man and a woman, specifically a man who's predominantly in his masculine and a woman who's predominantly in her feminine. That is the chemistry, right? That is the attraction, the magnetization, I guess, if you will, that brings us together. But it also, just like the magnet, like it can also feel very polarizing in terms of trying to integrate both of those inside of us.
Yeah, and I think this is where self-awareness comes into play. And this is really to me the big concept when we talk about this, because some people hear masculine and they shut off, and they hear feminine and they shut off, and they get, you know, and really it's a great conversation to have, because we all have pieces and aspects of both. And it's really about, you know, getting in touch with your emotions. And this is what relationships are all about, you know? So talk a little bit about having, you know, a little bit more about having that self-awareness of the masculine and the feminine aspects of us that we really do need to be there. It's important to have awareness of these emotions.
Absolutely. You know, I was reading something, it was based on some, you know, pretty credible research that was just saying that emotional intelligence is the meta skill of the 21st century, you know, especially with the advent and, you know, the ongoing integration of artificial intelligence. It's like, you know, logic, analytical thinking, critical thinking, yes, of course, that'll always be important, is becoming less of a virtue or less of a valuable skill set to cultivate, because we kind of have a superior intelligence that is replacing that. And so being in touch with your emotions, specifically in the 21st century and in 2024, is, I think it's imperative. Specifically, could be attributed to the importance of relationship. You know, emotion, for one, is sort of the language of the body. And I think we're moving into an era where the body is kind of, you know, and we're rebalancing the scales, I should say, away from being a mind dominant species, which has been here since, you know, the Stoic times, you know, since it's been the prominent organ, if you will, in antiquity, you know, that, you know, I think, therefore I am, you know, Rene Descartes. And yeah, exactly. So it goes way, 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 way back. But we're moving back into sort of this era of body intelligence and emotion, felt sense. You know, these are important pieces to body wisdom. And through that, it's like reconnecting with this sense of intuition, you know, this internal knowing that's less about computing something through the mind and more about knowing and connecting maybe with a higher power, divinity. And so I think as we move more into that era of rebalancing the scales, and of course, this can be translated, the body is typically representative of more of the feminine component and the masculine with the mind. We're moving back towards needing to find harmony again. And we can see that at every level. Every single system seems to be going through some form of transformation in terms of rebalancing the scales.
It kind of feels like it, yeah.
Yeah. And those are external systems, from the largest scale of, world systems and government and economic systems down to the nervous system, inside of us, the attachment system, the various systems that encapsulate and account for, our spirit, our soul, the unseen systems, if you will. So it's happening at every scale. So the emotional piece is such an important pathway to reconnecting with the body, to rebalancing the feminine, and ultimately just ushering in this new era.
How can a guy take all of that and go searching for his purpose?
Well, that's the great thing. Purpose isn't going to be found through your mind. Purpose, I think the common misconception, since we are so mind dominant, especially us men, right?
Men, yeah.
Right. The masculine is mind. So of course we're mind dominant, and it's a beautiful thing. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, any of the projections specifically that have come out of, Me Too era and whatnot that have made maybe it's emasculated essentially the modern man, the masculine in general. It's such an important piece. However, purpose is actually much more feminine. Purpose is something that we find deep within. It's that knowing.
Yeah.
And so, to get in touch with our emotions and to start speaking the language of the body, to start feeling into what I could only call capital T truth of who we are, which is at the foundation of purpose, right? Emotion itself is the pathway to get there. Understanding how we feel, tuning into the internal wisdom of our body, which is ultimately going to speak. It's going to inform us of who we are. And again, purpose is so often sort of misconstrued. It's understood to be something that we do. In the most simplistic human terms, sometimes we refer to it as our job. But on a spiritual level,
especially guys, it's how we identify ourselves a lot. Yeah,
of course. And don't get me wrong, that's an expression, and a very important expression at that, for the masculine, because it's the way that we go out into the world and live our purpose. It's one of the most prominent containers that we express that within. We live it out within, but it's so much deeper than that. It's very much a spiritual thing, and it can be it can seem overly simple, right? Which I think is correlated directly to trauma, our purpose. And I say that because trauma is actually, if you look at what trauma is, it's essentially, if I could just dumb it down to one word, it's disconnection, right?
Yeah.
Dissociation. So we're dissociating ourselves, we're disconnecting ourselves from our whole self, from the part of us that I believe comes out of the womb, if we're lucky, if we don't experience already so much trauma in the womb, that already leads to us being dysregulated, disconnected. But it's through life experiences, it's through the conditioning, it's through the traumas essentially that disconnect us from that sense of wholeness and that knowing of who we are, that a child tends to deviate away from that knowing, from that truth. So
it makes total sense. I mean, I guess the good news is in that trauma, there's plenty of room for pain and trauma to have redemption.
Of course.
if you're looking for it.
Of
Some
course.
people aren't. Some people like to sit and spin.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Well, the great thing is it's both what disconnects us from our purpose, trauma. And by purpose, I mean like who you are, like capital S self, like your truth, your essence, right? Which I believe is synonymous with purpose. But trauma will actually also lead us back to it because it leaves breadcrumbs, right? So if we're willing to follow that, if we're really seeking our purpose in life, it's actually a path of healing because we're following those breadcrumbs of what disconnected us from our purpose back to it. And so for me, I think that really is incentivizing for doing some of the healing work. Because let's be honest, healing isn't necessarily rainbows and butterflies.
No.
It's not
work.
whatsoever. It's work.
Yeah.
But I'd say it's the most rewarding thing that we could ever do because there's a reason why so many of us are seeking to understand our purpose in life because we're actually trying to reconnect back with our most whole, authentic, powerful, resilient self. Like who doesn't want that?
Well, I think you and me asked that question, but a lot of people, they seem willing to sit in the pain rather than use it as a force for good, unfortunately. And I don't mean many, many people, but I mean, it's out there. So how do you recommend somebody take those breadcrumbs back and get, okay, I've dealt with this stuff going on in my life. I want to understand my purpose better. What could they do?
Well, there's a number of frameworks that are out there. I'm definitely a very spiritual woo-woo, if you will. So I can both spiritualize, but also I'm heavily pragmatic. And so I like to follow some of these more scientific systems, some of the most, I guess, cutting edge or rather renowned modalities, if you will, that are part of psychology, they're part of neuroscience, child development. And a couple of those are just, working with the autonomic nervous system, which tends to be, one of the biggest systems in the body that is impacted by trauma. And specifically, learning how to self-regulate. And that's an important piece that becomes thwarted as a result of trauma, as a result of inconsistent, maybe care or co-regulation. If you guys, if the audience is familiar with these terms, that tends to be a result of trauma. Same goes with the attachment system. In a perfect child-parent relationship, specifically with our primary attachment figure, we have a secure attachment style, but that's not the case for the vast majority of us. Most of us have an insecure attachment style.
Yeah.
So as we sort of use these frameworks to understand, where we might fall on the scale in terms of, okay, is my nervous system more chronically dysregulated, or, do I have a regulated nervous system most of the time? Do I fall insecure attachment, or do I actually have one of these insecure attachment styles? And the list goes on with some of these other modalities. It actually provides sort of that framework, the breadcrumbs, if you will, that have broken it down into categorization that actually give us tools, practices to move along in the terms of attachment theory, along the continuum from insecure attachment back to secure attachment, right? Now, when we're insecure attachment, when we have a regulated nervous system, when we, another one is, internal family systems, which is parts work. When we're more rooted in the capital S self, we are inevitably going to know more about our purpose.
Yeah.
Because we are so much more connected to this wise, compassionate, grounded, centered self that we speak about in many spiritual traditions, right? And less in survival. And survival is kind of the general term that we'll use to describe what the state that one is in when they have a dysregulated nervous system, when their insecure attachment style is sort of hyperactive, if you will, and when it's really present or prominent. And so when we're living in survival, we're operating from that level of consciousness, if you will. We're operating from that frequency, if you want to get into energy.
This is an area where a lot of men hang out.
That's right.
It's just survival.
Which is sadly the norm. Because again, if you go back to, our fathers and our grandfathers who were products of the war and, post-depression era, like, that's what was needed to survive, was to sort of adopt some of these strategies, if you will, that are more survival. They're survival in nature. And do we need to continue to live those out today? For some of us that are truly facing genuine threat, yeah, of course, there's a place for it.
Yeah.
But if we're living, in suburbia, if we've got, a 9-to-5 job that is providing us with, consistent income, like if things are really going well, there's not really a reason to live in that survival state. And I think as we continue, my journey has been an ongoing sort of practice of trust, of learning to have faith more and more in not just having that either survival or the faith of the trust that I'm going to be provided for, not contingent on external circumstances, right? Which is kind of the creme de la creme in terms of spiritual enlightenment, right?
Well, what does that faith and trust look like for you? Because I know what it looks like for me, and that's been a big transition. I always use the analogy of, gripping the steering wheel, too tight. You kind of have to loosen your grip on that wheel, and that requires, trusting your source. In my case, it's God, that he's got me, and that everything's going to be okay. But there's a journey to get there. Of course.
Yes, of course.
Of course. I reflect on that journey now as a very special time frame. But how can we help guys stop gripping the wheel so doggone tight so that they can, but you're talking a lot about the nervous system, and that is very important. That nervous system goes straight right back into the heart. The amount of nerve endings that go to the heart are, I don't have the number in front of me. I just included it in my book. I want to say it's like 60,000 or something. I can't remember. I got an even number. I got all these numbers in my head, but it's a lot. It's a lot. And so when your body reacts, your heart reacts. And it's important to know that, because we make bad decisions sometimes when we're reacting with our head versus our heart. But
that's right. Absolutely.
Yeah. So how do we help guys here?
That's where I bring in the science with it, because it would be very unnatural to have faith in life itself when our nervous system, ultimately also our brain centers, have been developed in such a way, they call it like pruning, right? As we go through childhood development, to be optimized for survival. Right. And so when our brain and our nervous system is wired, is programmed for survival, to me, that's the opposite of faith.
Yeah.
So that's why I say, like, the fundamentals are really important. It's really hard to have faith and feel connected to a higher power. There's actually a section, there's a modality, I'll call it, of neuroscience. It's called polyvagal theory, which is essentially the science of the vagus nerve that I think you were referring to, and specifically as a lot of nerve endings that are going to the heart.
Yeah, I'm not technical like you.
Yeah. All good. No. This is, you were spot on. But it specifically involves the autonomic nervous system, because the vagus nerve, is the central most prominent nerve in the autonomic nervous system. And so there's actually, what polyvagal theory says is that there's 3 branches of the autonomic nervous system versus what was formerly believed to be 2. One of which being the sympathetic nervous system and the other being the parasympathetic nervous system, where polyvagal actually helps us understand that by way of the vagus nerve, there's actually 2 different branches of the parasympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic, you could look at it as the gas, it's the home of the fight or flight response. And the parasympathetic, to generally put it, is more of the rest and digest. It's more of the break of that system. So one of the, the highest, most recent development of the parasympathetic nervous system branch is called ventral vagal, or the ventral vagus. And essentially, most of us, when we are disconnected, when we are living in a place of survival, we don't have access to that branch, the ventral vagus branch. And so that's actually the home of, where we feel connected, where we feel safe, where we access trust and faith. And so when we're dysregulated as a result of trauma, we're going more between the sympathetic fight or flight response, right? And then what's called dorsal vagal shutdown in terms of the gas brake, which is more primitive. And it's not using our higher, even brain centers, like accessing the prefrontal cortex, which allows us to have more access to reason, executive functioning. And, these are imperative pieces for us to feel regulated enough, to feel safe enough to connect with something like faith, to connect with something like trust, because we're getting into the higher centers of our brain. We're getting into the more advanced parts of our consciousness, which moves us out of survival and into higher order thinking.
Well, there you go. All that to say, get in touch with your heart, right?
100%.
It's fascinating. The body is truly a miracle. I mean, it's absolutely a miracle. And to me, and this is something I made a great effort to try to do in my adult life here, is just get in touch with my body, my mind and my body, and connect everything. And I definitely feel like I'm living a much more healthier life, both mentally and physically. As a result, of course, it always helps to eat better and exercise right. But
of course,
that's a part of it. But as we wrap up today, Luke, please let everybody know how they can get in touch with you. You've got just a lot of fascinating things that you brought our way today. So how can the audience get in touch with you?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I would say that we only scratched the surface here today.
No, I know. We'd be here for another week if we really,
we really would. The best way to get in touch with me probably is through Instagram. If you're on Instagram, my handle is @purpose.state. And I post, I try to post several times per week. Speaking of the heart, they are transmissions from the heart. I don't quite get into the science as much maybe as we've got into here. Also, on top of that, my website, purposestate.com, I actually have a free masterclass that I'm offering there on living your purpose. And it goes through the fundamentals that actually gives you a roadmap to living your purpose. And I got a couple other freebies, a workbook that actually would, that basically reinforces and goes much deeper into what I shared here today. So I definitely highly recommend getting those on my website. And yeah, those are probably the best 2 touch points for me. I'm also on LinkedIn, but yeah.
There you go. Luke, thank you so much for being on the show today. Just a fascinating discussion, and man, you should check out Luke's stuff. This is really incredible, important discussion that we have today. Especially if you've, I was going to say, if you've had trauma in your life, but let's face it, guys, everybody's had trauma in their life. So don't try to fake it. Everybody's been there. And but if you're the type of guy that's like, I'm tired of living like this, hey, you want to figure out what your purpose is in life and overcome some of that stuff you've been carrying around, now's the time to do it. So Luke, thank you so much for being on the True Man podcast.
Mike, thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm just honor you, man, for creating the space and for being of service to so many of us men.
You bet. Thank you for being here.